Tonight, cracking down on that infuriating scam.
Canada Revenue Agency filed a lawsuit against your name.
The investigation moves from India to right here in Canada, a CBC News investigation. Is autism being overdiagnosed?
These sentences and statements scare me.
The Canadian-led study sparking debate. This is The National. We begin with new developments in the investigation of a scam that has cheated Canadians out of millions of dollars. It involves harassing phone calls that threaten arrest if you don't pay a tax bill. Last year, our colleagues at Marketplace located a major overseas call center behind the fraud, and that seemed to spur on the RCMP. Well, tonight, in our exclusive report, they tell David Common how their net has tightened, not just in India, but also here in Canada.
You're nervous, but they're going in. When we showed you this complex in India's largest city as the focal point for many of the scam calls, the RCMP were watching too. Within months, raids began across India, targeting multiple centers behind those calls so many Canadians have received.
Canada Revenue Agency filed a lawsuit against your name. There will be legal consequences and you will be arrested to defraud the government.
The RCMP acknowledges the investigation into this scam sat on the back burner for years, with tens of thousands of Canadian victims. That is now changing.
It's essentially a national priority investigation.
Inspector Jim Ogden runs Project Octavia. What's been happening? Are you hitting people?
Yes, since September of last year, there have been 39 call centers taken down, 45 people arrested.
That effort begins here, an RCMP detachment outside Toronto, where 12 investigators sift through leads, analyzing phone numbers, making the calls, and coordinating with police in India. But officers are also closing in on accomplices here in Canada. Police know who they are, what they're doing, moving the money from victims here back to India.
Certainly what I know and what I can share is that there are known targets, leads that we're following up on, and that when we get enough evidence, then we will charge and prosecute these individuals.
And just so I'm clear, are we talking about people who are in this country, in Canada?
That's correct.
Who are helping carry out this scam?
That's correct. They're defrauding the Canadian public and sending it away. They're money laundering.
There are so many call centers, though, it's unlikely any prosecution will end all of the scam. But the RCMP say they're already noticing fewer reported victims and less money being stolen. David Common, CBC News, Toronto.
2 weeks after a BC teenager was found dead of an apparent drug overdose, the province's police watchdog is launching an investigation into 2 officers who failed to find him. Someone called 911 after seeing a video of the boy, Carson Cremeni, online. The officers were sent to investigate, but they didn't see him. As Tanya Fletcher explains, Cremeni was found a few hours later, alone and in distress.
He was lying on his back, up against the fence. Had no shoes, he had no socks. He was struggling for air.
Daryl Cremeni has been placing flowers at the spot where he watched his grandson take his final breaths. It was after dark, around 10 p.m., he found the teen lying here just moments after first responders arrived.
I thought they could save him. You know, I mean, the police were trying to save his life as much as possible when I was here. If they got here at 8 o'clock, perhaps he could have been saved. But it wasn't the police who killed Carson. It wasn't.
14-year-old Carson Cremeni died of an apparent overdose. His family believes some older kids gave him drugs. They say witnesses watched and filmed, then posted it to social media. We now know the first call came from someone who'd seen one of the Snapchat videos and called 911. It was around 8 o'clock when officers first responded here to the skate park. They found nothing, so they left. It was nearly 2 hours later that Carson was discovered about half a kilometer from here. It's those critical moments BC's police watchdog is now investigating.
where the police were called to, what they did when they got there, how long they were there, what inquiries they made, police radio calls, or 911 calls. We'll put all that together to determine whether or not the actions of the police were reasonable in these circumstances.
This is bullying that led to murder.
Carson's father doesn't blame police for his son's death. Instead, he wants the teens who allegedly gave Carson the drugs held responsible. Charges have not been ruled out.
He was poisoned and filmed while he died, and I blame those boys.
Meanwhile, he says this growing memorial gives him some comfort.
Every time I come, there's more and more flowers.
Most of all, he's hopeful messages like this one, see something, say something, will prevent anyone from dying the way his son did. Tanya Fletcher, CBC News, Langley.
The Amazon rainforest continues to burn at a record pace. Given that it produces 20% of the world's oxygen, absorbing about a quarter of our fossil fuel emissions, this is a critical shield against climate change. Most of it lies in Brazil, and as smoke streaks across the country, Brazil's president says he doesn't have the resources to stop it. He's thrown up his hands, but not before pointing the finger. Jair Bolsonaro today again cast suspicion on NGOs for setting the fires. There's no evidence of that. Arthi Pol has more on what we do know about why so much of the Amazon is now going up in smoke.
It is the world's most important ecosystem, home to roughly 3 million species of plants and animals. And now the site of 165,000 fires burning at an alarming rate. In Brazil alone, the number of fires has hit a record high, a more than 80% increase compared to last year.
There's monkeys howling.
Canadian Jana Bell was awestruck when she visited the rainforest several years ago, but seeing the deforestation and destruction prompted her to start a charity to protect the Amazon.
The farmers down there do slash and burn farming, and so they chop down the trees and then they burn the trees. They use the ash as much needed fertilizer. The problem is once they start a fire, they can't control it. They can't stop it.
The new president of Brazil has basically said we're going to turn a blind eye to illegal clearing, illegal fires, to invasion by loggers and miners of indigenous peoples' reserves.
The president today for the first time acknowledged farmers may be behind the fires after repeatedly pointing the finger at NGOs. Meanwhile, the UN is sounding the alarm.
We're very concerned about these fires, both I think for the immediate damage that they're causing, and also because sustaining forests is crucial in our fight against climate change.
The state of Amazonas declared an emergency weeks ago. Some Brazilians are declaring where they stand on the issue too. Online, some A-list stars are adding their voice to the cause.
Public outcry over the issue, street protests, people complaining, op-eds and things like that, rather than trying to create more protected areas or something like that, because there's just not the political climate right now to sort of have that conversation.
Back in Toronto, Jana Bell says Canadians need to step up.
So it's not just about saving trees and animals, it's about saving ourselves.
The fear from scientists in Brazil and beyond is that the damage becomes irreversible. Arthi Pol, CBC News, Toronto.
To Ottawa now, where Canada welcomed America's top diplomat, and one issue dominated the discussion: China. Specifically, how to get 2 Canadians released from Chinese detention. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sat down for an exclusive TV interview with Power and Politics host Vassy Kapelos to discuss if any progress has been made.
Pleasantries exchanged. It was all about China right away.
We will, of course, be bringing up the plight of the 2 Canadians in China. And
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo immediately assured Prime Minister Trudeau the White House will continue to back up Canada's efforts to get Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig released. They've been held in China since December following Canada's arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. Their case was raised by President Trump directly with China's president, but in an interview with CBC News, Secretary Pompeo admitted the diplomatic pressure has failed to sway the Chinese.
Well, we've not been successful so far, and more importantly, we haven't gotten these 2 back to their homes and to their families.
Can you tell us what the response to President Trump's ask was?
I'd rather not talk about the conversations.
Trump's top diplomat also walked back comments his boss made, tying Meng's case to a potential U.S.-China trade deal. China insists the only way for Canada to resolve the diplomatic rift is to release Meng, something both Pompeo and his Canadian counterpart rejected.
There's no moral theory under which these two are
I
connected.
just want to be clear, though, for the Canadians who are watching, that there's no way in which Meng Wanzhou's case becomes a part of a trade deal with China. Is that what you're saying?
I've answered 6 questions. I think I've answered all of your questions.
Applying our extradition treaty with the United States, it's not a political decision.
An allied front, but one Canada doesn't have to go out of its way to thank the Americans for.
The fact that China is using its size and its power to bully smaller countries that are part of this larger Western alliance is an American issue. It's something that should concern the Americans. So it's not a favor they're doing for us.
Expect Canada to ask for more of the same from other countries at the G7 summit this weekend. Still hopeful the collective pressure will bend the so far unwavering will of the Chinese. Vashi Capellos, CBC News, Ottawa.
Same-sex marriage has been legalized in Canada for 14 years now, but that issue was unexpectedly front and center in the political debate today. It's all because the Liberals brought up a decade-old speech by Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, where he said same-sex marriage can't be considered marriage.
There's nothing more important to society than the raising of children, for its very survival requires it. Homosexual unions are by nature contradictory to this.
Andrew Scheer was a 25-year-old first-term opposition MP in 2005, explaining why he opposed the bill to legalize same-sex unions.
As they cannot commit to the natural procreation of children, they cannot therefore be married.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Scheer, like the vast majority of his Conservative caucus, led by Stephen Harper, voted against the bill. So did a number of Liberal MPs.
Mr. Macaulay.
Today, 14 years after that vote, Liberals decided to post Scheer's comments online and highlight how the Conservative leader refuses to take part in pride parades across the country. Scheer is a devout Roman Catholic. In recent years, he's avoided debate on major social conservative issues like abortion and same-sex marriage. But his position from 2005 is no secret.
I have my own personal beliefs and, my own faith background.
In fact, our Rosemary Barton asked him about that very speech when he ran for the Conservative leadership.
It happened in 2005. I was a member of Parliament at the time. I voted my conscience. I voted my constituents' wishes. It's not something that I'm looking to revisit or to reopen or things like that.
Today, his campaign team reiterated that point, saying Scheer supports same-sex marriage as defined in law and, as Prime Minister, will, of course, uphold it. Conservatives point out Liberal MPs have also opposed same-sex marriage or voted against it in the past, calling the video the Liberals shared today another desperation tactic from Trudeau on the eve of an election. Let's bring in our Parliamentary Bureau Chief, Rob Rousseau. And Rob, Andrew Scheer has said he's not going to reopen the marriage equality debate. So let's talk about what the Liberals hope to gain here.
Well, they hope to gain a couple of things, Ian. Number one, is it a diversion from the Ethics Commissioner's report on SNC-Lavalin? There might be something to it, but there's something probably more fundamental to this. They want to frame this campaign as a choice between someone who is a progressive and somebody who they are saying is anachronistic. So they've dug out something that hasn't been sort of buried for a long, long time. As you saw, Rosie asked him about this just 2 or 3 years ago. But a lot of first-time voters would not know that Andrew Scheer held this kind of opinion. He refuses to say now whether he holds the same view. What he said is he's not bringing it back. But those words out of Andrew Scheer's mouth and that kind of dim gray video making him look even more anachronistic is probably meant to try and tell younger voters, first-time voters, people who turned out in disproportionate numbers for the Liberals the last time, that if you are not so thrilled with Justin Trudeau, that's fine. But do you really want Andrew Scheer to be the person who becomes Prime Minister? If you don't, come on out and vote this time. Don't stay at home like you normally do.
But the Conservatives, Rob, are saying that this shows desperation on the part of the Liberals.
Well, it shows that they do need to get those people to come out and vote for them again if they're going to win another mandate. Desperation, maybe. Trying to frame the issue, yes. And has it already borne fruit for them? Yes, it has, Ian, because NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, based on what he saw today, probably not realizing it's an old issue, said that there's no way he can support a minority Conservative government, thereby throwing away almost all the leverage he would have in negotiating with a Liberal government for their support, which is baffling at this stage of the race.
Thanks, Rob.
My pleasure, Ian.
Some of the other stories we're following tonight. A Legionnaire's disease outbreak is spreading in Moncton, New Brunswick. Officials confirming 3 new cases of the pneumonia-like sickness today. That brings the total to 12 since last month. All the patients are recovering, but health authorities say the outbreak is not over and they're still working to absolutely confirm the source. In a massive $5 billion cash deal, the toy manufacturing giant Hasbro has moved to purchase Toronto-based media company Entertainment One. The deal brings together the maker of Transformers toys and the Monopoly game with the producer of children's shows like Peppa Pig and Clifford the Big Red Dog. The toy maker said the acquisition of the Canadian production company is aimed at expanding its brand's reach globally.
Nowhere in society should we be tolerating racism or anti-Semitism or misogyny.
Reaction today to the sentencing of newspaper editor James Scheer. He received the maximum 1-year jail sentence for his work in the Toronto-based publication Your Ward News. Scheer was found guilty of willfully promoting hatred against women and Jews in articles he wrote and edited over a 3-year period. The paper's publisher is set to be sentenced next week. To Washington now, where Donald Trump is confounding his critics again tonight on gun control. Ever since those back-to-back mass shootings left 32 people dead 3 weeks ago, the U.S. president has spoken often about taking action. But as Paul Hunter reports, it's not clear precisely how.
Remember Parkland and Newtown, Orlando, Vegas, San Bernardino, Dayton, El Paso, and countless others? Chief among those who can never forget, families of the dead.
My daughter died in Parkland.
Today on various U.S. talk shows, pressing for tougher gun laws yet again.
What more of an emergency situation can we envision for our country?
And slamming Donald Trump for saying he sympathizes while so far taking no action.
You are using the pain of the victims of gun violence to speak in a way that allows you to look like you're going to do something, but only to play games with their emotions and not do it in the end. I don't care about you, Mr. President, but I hate what you do.
Case in point, Trump after the shooting in El Paso.
We have to have meaningful background checks.
Then yesterday, dropping the word meaningful.
I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks.
Moments later, hedging further.
It's a slippery slope.
Slippery slope, a standard line from the NRA used by Trump the day after a phone call with the head of the NRA. Then tonight, another turn, tweeting about a very good meeting on preventing mass shootings, talks with both parties, and a hint at meaningful legislation that'll make a real difference. All of that on the heels of a call to action yesterday from students of Parkland who released their plan for laws to curb gun violence.
But the real fear in this country remains. What if nothing ever changes? In the 19 days since those 2 big mass shootings in Texas and Ohio, there have been 18 other mass shootings here. More will follow. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
Later on the National, in-depth in Hong Kong, how 3 Canadians are conflicted by living there. But next, new questions about the way autism is diagnosed. A Canadian-led study looks at whether the bar is too low.
We are now diagnosing and seeing people who identify as autistic who we may not have considered that way in the past.
The implications for treatment next. There are new questions tonight about how autism is being diagnosed. A Montreal researcher who helped comb through decades of data says the bar for being diagnosed with autism is now so low, the difference between those who have it and those who don't could be disappearing. Around the world, the rate of diagnosis has been climbing for years. As of 2015, an estimated 1 in 66 Canadian children had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Boys far more frequently than girls. More than half were diagnosed by the time they hit 6 years old, almost all of them by the time they were 12. The diagnosis can be key to getting early intervention for a child with autism spectrum disorder, but as Christine Birak explains, for researchers there's a downside to having so many cases under that heading.
It's right.
Despite being nonverbal, Peter's motor skills aren't bad. Peter's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but if he'd been born decades ago, researchers say he might not have been.
These sentences and statements scare me.
A Canadian-led review analyzed the results of nearly a dozen previous studies published between 1966 and 2019. To diagnose autism, psychological and neurological tests still examine differences in traits like social and motor skills, intellectual development, and facial expressions. But the review found, now that it has broadened into a spectrum, the diagnosis includes more people.
30 years ago, you needed to have a very strong difference at the social level, at the level of facial expression, and so on. Now it just has to be slightly diminished.
Researchers say that's making it harder to find treatments for those on the severe end of the autism spectrum. They also worry that not everyone on that spectrum belongs there, but parents need a diagnosis to unlock treatment.
Parents are obliged to say something that possibly they don't even believe because they want to obtain services.
Other doctors view it differently.
We are now diagnosing and seeing people who identify as autistic who we may not have considered that way in the past, and their presentation may be a bit more mild, but I want to emphasize that their challenges that they experience are quite real.
For Peter's mom, it all boils down to this.
If you need glasses, you should be able to get them. It doesn't matter what intensity your prescription is, but you need the right prescription. So for our kids, it's the same thing. They have different needs. Some will need very little or none, and some will need a lot.
All sides agree, regardless of labels, the goal is to get kids the help and care they need. Christine Birak, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, let's bring in Dr. Danielle Martin, a family physician at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, and of course a regular contributor to our health panel. And Dr. Martin, when a family comes to you wondering if their child is on the autism spectrum, what are the things that you consider?
Well, there isn't a simple blood test or urine test for the autism spectrum disorder. And so we're asking questions and observing a child's behavior to see whether that child is meeting developmental milestones and observing how they relate to others, whether they're engaging in repetitive or restrictive behaviors. So there are a set of criteria that get used. Often in primary care, we're simply identifying that a kid is not meeting the milestones we would expect and then referring them on for more in-depth multidisciplinary assessment.
And if they were to be diagnosed as being on the spectrum, what's the significance of that?
Well, you know, one of the most important things that the significance of it is that unlocks resources to help that child and that family. And we know that early intervention and behavioral support for children on the autism spectrum is really important in helping kids to achieve their best potential. And so although the label can sometimes be frightening for families, when it's appropriately and correctly applied, it often unlocks access to resources that can be really useful.
And what about concerns that autism might be overdiagnosed?
Well, this is what happens when you change the definition of a disorder. So we used to say that there was autism and Asperger's and these different kind of watertight compartments, and now there's recognition that autism is a spectrum, and we've enlarged that definition. And so we're necessarily now going to pick up more folks in that more enlarged definition. I think we have to watch issues around social stigma and around over-labeling variants of normal human behavior. A lot, people are different, but certainly when you see a kid who's struggling developmentally and not hitting basic milestones or meeting their language milestones, I think it's really important that we intervene as quickly as possible. And so part of the spectrum issue is trying to make sure that we pick up those kids with milder symptoms earlier so we can help them.
Dr. Martin, always nice hearing from you. Thanks.
Thanks.
And there's lots more still ahead on tonight's National. The NFL player who could use a geography lesson, and the Winnipeggers eager to help. But next, life in a polarized city. 3 Canadians face conflicted choices amid Hong Kong's political unrest.
We've got to wait and see what happens. We can't just abandon everything that we've set up here. We can't just abandon our family and our friends.
British government is hunting for answers about this man, Simon Cheng. He worked in the UK consulate in Hong Kong, and he was taking a train into mainland China when he disappeared. The Chinese authorities now say he's been detained for soliciting prostitution. Others worry that it was his online support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement that made him a target. Now the Canadian Hong Kong consulate has canceled travel into mainland China for its local staff. For months now, the words Hong Kong and tension have been uttered in the same breath. One side sees a fight for democracy. The other sees thugs whipped up by foreign interests. The territory is being torn apart, and for Hong Kongers with links to Canada, the rip runs right through their communities, sometimes even their families. Chris Brown is in Hong Kong, and he has their stories.
Just over here, we've got some gloves. You're also going to want something to protect your crotch.
With Hong Kong in the midst of a fight for its heart and soul, this military supply store has become a go-to destination for a Canadian we're calling Robbie.
I'm sorry for the disguise.
Robbie says he's never incited violence, but believes he could be arrested anyway just for being on the side of protesters. Aside from his fears of possibly being arrested, there's another, arguably more important reason for the disguise. Many in his family don't agree with him, especially his Chinese-born wife.
We have had some serious arguments. I'd say that we came very close to actually getting a divorce.
He was born in Canada, met his wife at a Canadian university, and then they moved to Hong Kong more than a decade ago.
Ever since the protests started in June, we've just been not just on opposite sides of the fence, but it's like we're worlds apart in what should be done and how to handle it.
So sometimes, without her knowledge, he says he comes to the store to buy survival gear for the protesters so they can stay safe in dangerous situations.
I do try to understand the complex feelings that she must be going through, but on the other hand, I know that if I want to be on the right side of history, I've got to stand with Hong Kong as it struggles to maintain what it has.
There's no way to know how many Canadians living here support the protesters and how many side with the administration and China, but it seems no one remains neutral. Just before Sunday's huge protest, we met up with Canadian Edward Chin.
Just to bring a message to Beijing, actually, that don't use the police as a political means, just to divide Hong Kong people.
He was making signs and preparing to take to the streets.
Danny.
Chin is an author of investment books, and he's a recognizable business figure. He used to work for TD Bank. Most business people toe the line so as not to offend China, but not him.
I think we have to go by what we believe in as someone that uphold our freedoms, core values.
Values that include preserving Hong Kong's special one country, two systems status and pushing back against Beijing's purported encroachments on that. These days, he's also giving financial advice to people here worried about what this uncertainty is doing to their investments. His outspokenness has got China's attention. When the VP of Huawei was arrested in Canada and China detained 2 Canadians in response, Chin spoke out loudly for the men's release.
My office was visited by police, and also my home. They sent the fire truck, ambulance people, and police. They came for intimidation, 8 times totally, 8 times in 2 days. Yeah.
But he says the intimidation didn't work. At that big protest, Chin came out and brought his 8-year-old son Nathan with him.
And Nathan has been to 2 or 3 different marches. He knows that democracy doesn't fall into your lap. You have to walk. You don't have to fight, real fight, but you have to have a peaceful demonstration like this.
But the protests haven't all been peaceful. One of the enduring symbols of the unrest has been tear gas. It's been fired, according to police, when aggressive protesters have targeted police stations or metros in many neighborhoods,
There wasn't anything
including near the Kowloon Street, where artist and teacher Rachel Smith lives.
July 14th, there was a lot of protesting and tear gas, so these are all sirens that are happening.
She created these incredible matchboxes as a type of daily diary, each one telling the story of a different event.
First, it was one of the big protests. 2 million people came out on the street, and everybody has a story, and then this piece goes in here, and then you look at it this way. Everything's tense, everything's uncertain, uncomfortable in many ways, but also not unexpected. This has been coming for a very, very long time.
Smith is originally from southwestern Ontario, but she moved here 15 years ago when she married her Hong Kong-born husband. He didn't want to appear on camera himself again, out of fear of reprisals. She's taken part in the protests, and though many here will see her as an outsider, she says she feels like it is her fight.
I'm not the right person in the right circumstance. I don't have the right face. I don't have the right place. But it's my fight in that it's my family and it's people that I care about, and it's a city that I've absolutely loved living in for the last 14 years.
She says people in Canada often ask her, is it safe? When will you leave?
If I decide to leave, me with my foreign passport, my husband can come with me, maybe my in-laws. But who else can I take? Can I take all my friends? Can I take along my ex-students? We've got to wait and see what happens. We can't just abandon everything that we've set up here. We can't just abandon our family and our friends.
There is in Hong Kong today a big distrust about the existing political system, as all the rallies and demonstrations show. None of the Canadians we talked to could predict how this ideological battle would end, but all of them felt it was now their cause as well. Chris Brown, CBC News, Hong Kong.
As the push to pick sides intensifies, some Canadians in Hong Kong choose the police. Take Joseph Chan of Toronto. He believes protesters have been crossing the line in clashes, like a recent scene in Hong Kong's Yuen Long station.
They were going into the Yuen Long station, and then they take them like banters and then start hitting people and then start hitting police, everything like that. This is bad. This is not acceptable. I understand why they're doing it, but it's still not acceptable. The law is the law.
There was lots of vandalism and taunts, but it's not clear whether violence happened in Yuen Long like Chan describes. A peaceful demonstration last night ended with a brief but tense standoff. There were no official reports of injuries. Coming up next, tracking an endangered killer whale, how salmon are key to the search.
If we understand the movement of the prey and behavior of the prey, we can understand more about what the killer whales have to do in order to find those prey.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, a deep dive into the Base, an extreme neo-Nazi hate group that's recruiting here in Canada. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. We're following a deadly thunderstorm in Eastern Europe. Emergency crews scramble to help those caught in the mountains of southern Poland. At least 4 people were killed and more than 100 others injured. A 5th person died in Slovakia when lightning knocked him into a gorge. Brexit talks continued in Paris today with a focus on the so-called Irish backstop, a measure aimed at preventing a hard border in Ireland. Emmanuel Macron called it indispensable, but the new UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, argued there was room for change.
We think that there are ways of protecting the integrity of the single market and allowing the UK to exit from the EU.
Johnson remains committed to leaving the European Union on October 31st. And Fisheries and Oceans Canada has released its first ever State of Canadian Pacific salmon report. The findings are bleak. Sockeye, coho, and Chinook numbers are declining across BC. Researchers say climate change is largely to blame. Hotter ocean temperatures are affecting habitat and disrupting the marine food web. That's bad news for BC's southern resident killer whales. They rely on Chinook as their main food source, and scientists are worried they're not getting their fill. Earlier this month, it was announced that 3 missing orcas are presumed dead. At least one of them was emaciated. Now there are just 73 left. So tonight we're revisiting a story by Briar Stewart about a cross-border project to tag Chinook and track their prey.
If you spotted the Zephyr trawling off the coast of Washington state, you might think this is one of the many fishing vessels in the area.
It's going to be enough for 5 hooks.
But this is not your ordinary fishing trip.
There you go. Get a good fight. It's a pretty fish.
This must get hard to do if it's very rough conditions, right? And
Yeah.
you're rocking all over the place.
Right. It gets tricky when the weather gets rougher. It's a really nice calm day for surgery today.
Salmon surgery, that is. This team of U.S. government scientists is tagging Chinook, but this is not just about the salmon. That's because the salmon are the main prey for the endangered southern resident killer whales. These orcas only hunt for fish.
Certainly, there's been a tremendous interest in the United States and in Canada as well in the plight of the southern resident killer whales. And I think it really has raised awareness of what might be happening out in the ocean.
On board the boat, once the salmon are caught, they're put in a mixture of clove oil and water, which acts as an anesthetic. They're then cut open. An acoustic tag is inserted into their abdomen. Afterwards, they're stitched back up and then moved in to the recovery unit, basically a cooler with ocean water.
You can see he's already waking up. It'll just be another minute or so and he'll be upright and looking feisty, and then we'll let him recover a little bit longer and release him.
The tags communicate with receivers that have been placed in the ocean.
560.
This crew is hoping to tag 300 juvenile Chinook. And similar work is going on off the coast of Vancouver Island, where researchers with the University of British Columbia are tagging 100 adult salmon. It's all part of an effort to track the dwindling populations.
If we understand the movement of the prey and behavior of the prey, we can understand more about what the killer whales have to do in order to find those prey and where they might be going and spending their time.
A pod of southern residents was spotted near Tofino, BC at the end of May, and scientists were overjoyed when a new calf was swimming alongside them. Just last year, another image caused dismay. This mother carried around her dead calf for 17 days in an apparent act of grief. They're normally here throughout June, but they aren't around this year.
Wow, aren't these guys beautiful?
So it's the transient killer whales that have been delighting tourists in the waters between Vancouver and Victoria. They're a different type of orca.
What a nice big line of whales.
They're thriving because, unlike the resident orcas,
a whole group of them. Aww.
They will happily munch on one of the many seals in the area.
By now, I am quite sure that they have had something to eat.
Marine naturalist Joan Lopez explains to those on board this whale-watching boat why they're not likely to see the endangered orcas this time of year.
I usually tell them that they just haven't been seen in the area for a long time, and we believe that is because there currently aren't enough Chinook salmon returning to the river area, so they have to be somewhere else to get food. If it's got kids to feed, when you've got youngsters, you better go where there's food in the cupboard.
Because there have been so few sightings of them, it's meant that researchers who've been tracking the southern residents for years had to delay their studies this season.
So the dog is at the front of the boat?
Deborah Giles has spent the last 10 summers in a boat on the Salish Sea. She's part of a team that has trained dogs to sniff out, well, whale poop. And she recalls one of her best finds.
And it was just a beautiful sample, huge and fatty rich. It was gorgeous.
Not too many people describe fecal samples that way, but
it's true.
I get that you're passionate about it.
But after you know the kind of information that you can get from a sample like that, it's like gold. It really is like gold.
She and a team analyzed the fecal samples to learn about the whale's health. They can tell whether they were pregnant and if they're getting proper nutrition.
The whales are in a famine and deeper famine. These whales are not getting enough to eat at any time in the year.
This spring, the federal government put in place more restrictions to limit commercial and recreational fishing in BC. More than 100 gathered to protest, calling the move political. But Giles completely disagrees.
I've heard things like, well, they're eating our fish. And my reply to them is, no, actually, technically, we're eating their fish. They were here first. They evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago to eat Chinook salmon. We're the ones that are eating their fish.
Back on the Zephyr, scientists are hoping the tagging projects give them a sense of the Chinook's behavior, how deep they travel, and where they go. They hope the data can help shape future policy when it comes to protecting the Chinook.
I think some populations of salmon are really at risk. I do worry, 20 years from now, what populations will still be around and which ones won't. There he goes.
And he worries what the Chinook's fate will mean for the orcas whose survival depends on them. Briar Stewart, CBC News, off the coast of Washington State.
Since that story aired at the beginning of July, the team at NOAA says it's tagged 200 salmon. In 2 weeks, they expect to get their first glimpse at where the salmon are. Just ahead, the woman who really wanted to become a U.S. citizen. Our moment is on the way.
Well, right before the ceremony, I was approached and said, well, we have a special situation here.
Protecting her right to bear arms and a baby. But first, in case you missed it, a rookie NFLer triggered good-natured ridicule with his glaring error in Canadian geography. Today, Winnipeg hosted the Green Bay Packers and the Oakland Raiders. The Raiders tried to show love for their host city, but A.J. Cole's shirt placed Winnipeg in Alberta. Online scorn was swift, as was Cole's humble response. Apologies to the citizens of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Just a kid from Atlanta, Florida, playing football in Oakland, Nevada, with a low geography IQ. Don't worry about it, bud, said one Winnipegger. I got another shirt for you if you need to borrow one. At the tailgate party, Canadians were mostly forgiving.
I try not to put too much into it. He's probably never been here, so, he probably didn't even make the T-shirt that they were on Instagram.
In fact, he bought it on Amazon.
I just think it's just indicative of what they talk about in the States. They really don't know the difference between Winnipeg and Alberta and BC and Toronto.
There's something I want you to see.
So what do you think? This is all Heartland?
Yeah.
It's so big.
And with an E. New season this fall on CBC.
It was supposed to be just another U.S. naturalization ceremony at another convention center. Then someone said the words, "A lady has just gone into labor." No, the judge didn't have to deliver the baby, but the mother was refusing to leave until she was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. So plans had to be juggled, the judge had to improvise, and the result is our moment.
When required by the law.
When required by the law.
Right before the ceremony, I was approached and said, well, we have a special situation here. I said, oh, what was that situation?
I'm 37 weeks pregnant. I started getting contractions as I was walking to the ceremony.
She refuses to go to the hospital before she gets sworn in. That made me nervous because I don't know how to deliver a baby.
The immigration laws are under attack. That's why I applied for the citizenship ceremony. We don't leave home lightheartedly, right? You come for better opportunities. And I really hope that everyone that comes here and is trying for a better life gets that opportunity, because this is the land of dreams, right?
So that woman only wants her first name used, Tatev. And so the thing is, her child would be a U.S. citizen under the so-called birthright rules. But in case those rules change, she wanted to make sure that the baby's mother, that she would be an American citizen. So that's why she did that. There were 3,200 people at that one ceremony being sworn in as citizens that day. So that's one way to get to the front of the line. That is the National for this Thursday, August the 22nd. Good night.